250,000 vulnerable people are not receiving the support of what's called an appropriate adult while in police custody. A report has suggested the Home Office commissioned report says lack of awareness and a shortage of trained volunteers has meant police often go ahead without one present. Appropriate adults support children or vulnerable adults when they're being interviewed by police. They were introduced in the 1980s following miscarriages of justice involving vulnerable people and are supposed to ensure effective communication, fair treatment and that interviewees' rights and welfare are safeguarded. Local authorities are required to organise appropriate adult schemes when children are in contact with the police, but there's no duty to do the same in respect of vulnerable adults. Well, Amy Byrne has been an appropriate adult and scheme coordinator for 2 years, working on more than 100 cases before she left the job in March. And Michael Brown is a police officer who trains other officers how to deal with vulnerable suspects, and he joins us from Birmingham. Amy, tell us more about what being an appropriate adult actually involves.
Okay, so I was an appropriate adult and the scheme coordinator for 2 years. I also managed a team of volunteers who predominantly actually did the call-outs, but I went on lots of call-outs myself. So as an appropriate adult, you're really there to safeguard the rights of vulnerable people. So vulnerable people can include people with mental health difficulties, learning disabilities, somebody who might have had a brain injury or have a condition such as autism. So it's really important that these people get support in custody, which can be an incredibly intimidating environment. So an appropriate adult gets called, they show up at the station, they're involved in the process before the interview, so making sure that the vulnerable person knows their rights, knows that they're entitled to free legal advice, also that they get their samples done, so things like fingerprints, photograph, DNA, which again can all seem quite intimidating. They're also really importantly there for the interview process, and they're not there to act merely as an observer, as the Police and Criminal Evidence Act states. They're actually there to support the person in the interview, to advise and to interject if they feel that the police's line of questioning is unfair, or if the person's welfare isn't being looked after. So it's kind of all about fairness in the process.
And how have you found the role to be in terms of how important it is to the people who are getting that help? Have you been in situations where you've thought, if I wasn't here, this really would not be good for that particular person?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think all of the volunteers who work tirelessly for the service would agree that, you can spend quite a lot of time in custody and you can make quite a lot of difference to the process for that person. I mean, have you had to step in and say to a police officer that line of questioning is not fair because of this person's particular vulnerability? Yeah, I think I have. I think we're trained and our volunteers are trained in mental health. And, the police are under immense time pressures, we all know that. And sometimes there could be a tendency in the interview to maybe rush a question or, phrase it in a certain way. So it's up to the appropriate adult to have the confidence to assertively step in and, ask the police to rephrase the question. And it really can assist the police and the vulnerable person in making sure the interview goes really smoothly and the best outcome is achieved.
Michael Brown, how important do you think the role is of an appropriate adult? How necessary is it?
Very necessary, for all the reasons just given, and I won't repeat them. It's just a crucial safeguard. It's crucial that people understand what their rights are. It's absolutely crucial that if police officers are doing anything from the overuse of jargon through to lines of questioning that might not necessarily be fair and are likely to lead to what's known as suggestibility, in other words, a likelihood to agree with a police officer because of a desire to please or react in a certain way, it's a vital appropriate adult can step in and challenge that where necessary.
But it sounds like, therefore, the police need to be kept in check. It's the police that are being watched here as much as anything. They're not doing it as they should be necessarily when it comes to these vulnerable people.
Well, that's one way of looking at it. I mean, you've got to remember that the number of different mental health, cognitive problems, other medical conditions that might give rise to the need for an appropriate adult are very, very many and varied. And police officers are not specialist mental health experts. Officers may not necessarily realise the particular nuances of how somebody with a particular kind of specialist learning difficulty might need to be treated. It's perhaps more about reminding officers and helping them as much as it is sort of keeping them in check.
There is not a requirement for there always to be an appropriate adult in a case where an adult is involved. There has to be one when it comes to children. Does that potentially lead to the risk of evidence being thrown out in court because a court might deem that an interview wasn't carried out fairly because of that?
In principle, it could. I mean, I've got operational experience of a situation where, despite the very best efforts of police officers over a 12-hour period, we just could not obtain an appropriate adult for a vulnerable adult. The particular gentleman I'm thinking of had no available friends or relatives that would be appropriate. We couldn't engage another authority like a mental health service or social services. And after an awful lot of trying and failing more than once, we got to a point where it was a question of, do we proceed with an interview without an appropriate adult, albeit yes with a solicitor present, or do we not? Obviously, if an interview did proceed in those circumstances where the police might argue they had little choice but to proceed, it's up to a court to decide whether that interview remained fair in those particular circumstances, and the courts have discretion to exclude the admissibility of the interview if they felt there was anything untoward.
So, Amy, do you think it should be obligatory for appropriate adults to be called in when it comes to adults
yes,
as well?
absolutely, because as Inspector Brown was saying, you know, I think the police are left in a difficult situation where they don't have access to a service. You know, my service in Hackney is actually really fortunate to be commissioned in Hackney and to support Hackney and Newham, but we get phone calls from other boroughs asking us for an appropriate adult. Now, this delays the process, and it could make the police inclined, you know, to overlook things just because they want to get the process finished, which is understandable. I mean, if it was a statutory, as it is for young people, it would be a much smoother process. I think money would be saved. Vulnerable people would not have to spend such a long time in custody.
They do have a solicitor there, though, don't they?
Well, not necessarily. It's their right to have a solicitor, and the police do explain this when the person goes into custody, but often people are kind of angry, agitated, you know, it's stressful. So one of the most important roles of the AA is to actually tell someone that they do have entitled to a free, independent legal advice, and also, you know, to encourage them. We actually call and say to the person in custody, when we get the first call, you know, we really think you should have a solicitor. People sometimes say, I haven't done anything wrong. We say it does not matter. You know, you still should be accessing legal advice. And an AA can also actually insist on a solicitor against the vulnerable person's will, which I've had to do once. And can cause kind of a bit of a fractious wait because the person can be upset. But the time when I recall doing it, actually the person was so grateful because they were quite unwell at the time, experiencing, you know, some quite strong psychotic symptoms. And actually some things came out of the interview that they weren't aware of before. And afterwards they thanked me wholeheartedly for insisting on a solicitor because, you know, their outcome and their will be improved.
Amy Byrne, Michael Brown.
It's important to remember that the appropriate adult has got a right to insist on a solicitor being called.
Yeah.
What they don't have is a right to make sure that the person in custody sees that solicitor.
Yes.
The person
Yeah.
in custody retains that right to make their own decisions, notwithstanding that they're deemed to be a vulnerable adult.
Yeah.
But I think all of this highlights the problem. I don't think any police officers have got any issues with, you know, a good number of safeguards of vulnerable people in custody, and I don't think any police officers would object to better and more effective mechanisms to make sure we could get appropriate adults for vulnerable adults much more quickly, so that delays in custody are minimised. All of that, I think, has got to be welcomed, but it must be borne in mind, unless somebody somewhere eventually wins a statutory obligation to provide an appropriate adult, whether that's commissioned through the third sector, from what have historically been volunteers, or whether it's commissioned from a statutory authority, unless that happens, the police service could, in theory, end up in a position where you just can't obtain a vulnerable adult, an appropriate adult for a vulnerable adult.
It's interesting and good
Yeah.
to talk to you both. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.